Yeah, and you said it. That's exactly the answer. And this has really been the union's answer for really half a century, is that they see it as a unnatural restraint on player compensation, and something unnatural to market forces. They believe in market-based systems, and as revenues go up, player salaries should go up, and that sort of direct relationship.
It's time for Sportsnaut's MLB podcast. Big League Buzz, news and interviews from around the majors. Here's your host, Scott Gulbranson.
Welcome, everybody, to Big League Buzz, the Major League Baseball podcast from Sportsnaut. I'm your host, Scott Gulbranson. Today, we're delving into the escalating labor tensions in Major League Baseball, particularly the contentious debates surrounding a potential salary cap. To help us navigate this complex topic and issue, we're thrilled to be joined, of course, by our guest today. That is one Mr. Eric Fisher. Eric is a writer and sports writer, I should say, and newsletter writer at Front Office Sports. Eric joins us from the MLB All-Star Game down in Atlanta. Eric, thanks for being with us and talking baseball today.
Hello.
All right. Okay, so I read this story. I've been watching it for a while now. Elaborate a little bit on the Major League Baseball owners and their key arguments for a salary cap, focusing sort of on Commissioner Manfred's concerns about revenue and payroll disparities. For example, the Dodgers' $320 million payroll versus the Marlins, who have a payroll of $67 million. Kind of frame this for us and where he's coming from.
Yeah, so he's kind of fighting a war on two fronts, so to speak, where there's the sort of the classic, labor versus management situation. And we've got a labor deal that was signed in early 22 that expires at the end of next year, December 26th. And so there's a lot of preparation already happening now in advance of that. So you have that sort of classic back and forth between players and owners. But at the same time, Rob Manfred has got his own internal issues among owners where the haves and the have-nots are widening. There's always been haves and have-nots in the sport, but the difference between the top and the bottom end is magnifying, and it has to pretty significant degree just in the last few years. It's not just because the Dodgers are spending more and more, and their actual luxury tax calculation for this year will be over $400 million. The issue is that you've got some retreat on the other end, that you've got teams like the Marlins and the Pirates that are actually below where they were in prior years, even as revenues continue to increase. And so that's why I say I think, Rob Manfred's in a particularly difficult position where he's sort of fighting a war on two fronts.
Well, yeah. And Eric, this isn't new, right? Owners have pushed for it a handful of times over the last, 50 years or so, even briefly forcing sort of a salary cap back in 94, 95. What's the Players Association's primary concern with the salary cap, particularly its potential to restrain compensation and impose spending limits that may reduce current team spending?
Yeah, and you said it. That's exactly the answer. And this has really been the union's answer for really half a century, is that they see it as a unnatural restraint on player compensation, and something unnatural to market forces. They believe in market-based systems, and as revenues go up, player salaries should go up, and that sort of direct relationship. But they also point to some very specific outcomes in other sports, particularly the NFL, which has a cap, of course, and every spring you have sort of what they call sort of a bloodletting of sorts, where there's all sorts of machinations having to go, where good players are being cut, quarterbacks are being approached to restructure their deals, or take less money now, rework the deal in some fashion to allow a team to bring in other players, stay competitive, and remain under the cap. And they see that as really bad for players and just unnatural as well. And so this is a lot of where the MLB Players Association is coming from, that there's a principle that's been in place for decades, but they, on a very tangible, real world basis, they see negative outcomes elsewhere in sports that they don't want to copy.
Is it tough for them, Eric, to kind of balance? Because obviously, yes, when you have a change like a salary cap, and you mentioned, I think the NFL is a good example of that, where you see good players get cut due to cap issues. But at the same time, look at how the NFL has continued to explode from a revenue standpoint, a popularity standpoint, TV deals, all of that. When the players are weighing that, Is it so much? Are they so much focused on protecting those players and those roles and missing the big picture a little bit, or what do you think about that?
Well, I think part of what's happening is the big picture is going to sort of be redefined. A big part of what we're talking about here is an outgrowth of what remains a locally driven revenue model in baseball, where much of the difference between a big market team like the Dodgers and a smaller revenue team like the Marlins owes to what they are able to generate in revenue in their own respective markets. The NFL is exploding because they have a much more nationalized model, and your Pittsburghs and Green Bays and so forth can compete just as vigorously with a Dallas or New York Giants or whoever, and in some cases much better. And I think what baseball would like to do, and this is part of what Rob Manfred talks about with reworking all of the TV deals in 2028, if they can get to a more nationalized media structure and a more nationalized revenue structure, then you can start to think about these things in a pretty fundamentally different way and maybe get to the kinds of things that we're talking about in a more natural way.
Yeah, I mean, we saw the destruction of the regional markets with TV,
Right.
with the Bally's going belly up. So yeah, absolutely, huge issue for them. Now, Manfred, you talk about obviously him driving this. The strategy he's had with direct communication with players,
Yes.
sort of bypassing union leaders. What risk does that pose to the union and unity as the CBA expires coming up next December?
Yeah, this is a sort of potentially high risk, high reward kind of strategy that, ultimately the MLB Players Association is a member driven institution, and this, regardless of what anybody thinks of them as an organization, they operate by and for their members. And the last labor deal, it's important to remember that the executive committee was against it, but the rank and file were for it, and it ended up passing because a plurality of the rank and file were for it. And this is kind of the thinking this time around, that if Manfred can meet with individual players, get his point across, maybe a similar situation can happen again in 2026, where regardless of what executive leadership at the union, either from a staff basis or a executive committee player basis, thinks of what's on the table, again, if a plurality of players like it, maybe they can get to a different place. That's the overarching strategy. I also think there's some personality issues at play that I think the principals involved on both sides of the table don't necessarily like each other that much.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, you talk about cities, small markets, great baseball towns like Cincinnati,
Yep.
of course, Pittsburgh, you mentioned them earlier on. The disparities there in what the owners make, what they spend, given no small market team has won a World Series since 2015 with the Royals, obviously, the payroll, the postseason correlations. If you're a fan and you're sitting there and you're watching this unfold, what does this mean for fans, and how much is it believed that this inability to have this salary cap across baseball hurting cities like that and a fan's perspective as far as just having a competitive team?
Yeah, it's a tough thing if you're a fan in those markets, because the years go by and nothing really sort of happens competitively, or you see a great player come up through the system and then ultimately go somewhere else to have the back end of his career. It's also difficult to watch when you look at something like San Diego, where they've got a difficult situation there, not the biggest market. They're sort of landlocked, around where the ocean's on one side, Mexico's on the other, the desert's on another side, and on the north side is Los Angeles. They're kind of boxed in all the way around, but yet they draw great, they spend a lot, and they're competitive year in and year out, and they look like they're well on their way to being back in the playoffs. And that's the thing. Well, if San Diego can do it, why can't a Cincinnati or a Pittsburgh or whoever, and just literally just try harder? And that's sort of the rub. And I think, again, that sort of speaks to, that's certainly a fan sentiment out there, but I think also within baseball leadership and among some of the teams, that's sort of a thinking, well, San Diego can go out and do it. Why not some of these other teams?
Yeah, no question. And of course, then you have a new market coming in eventually in a couple of years. You have Las Vegas, of course, the A's, who are in limbo right now, going there. So many interesting pieces here with baseball. And if you look at the health of the sport all the way around, you see a resurgence this year with some attendance across the league, and things are going pretty well. You have some great stories with Cal Raleigh. It seems like baseball has an opportunity to take advantage of these young players. but this labor strife kind of over this dark cloud over it. When you look at this opportunity for an agreement, do you feel like the owners are going to really stick to their guns on the salary cap thing, or are we too far away, being a year and a half out from the end of this CBA, to really understand what it might come down to?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot between now and then, and I think things can sort of change in terms of where sentiment goes and where that sort of plurality shifts. But you raise a really good point here that there is definitely some real wind at the back of the sport right now, and there's an opportunity to try to build upon that and not shoot themselves in the foot. And this is kind of how it was back in the early 90s before we got to that 1994 strike, where you had expansion, you had rising attendance, and things were sort of on the upswing in a lot of respects. 92, 93, that sort of thing. And then 94, 95 happened, and it took a long time to build back up. And it took Cal Ripken and a Yankees dynasty and some other things to really bring baseball back from the abyss, so to speak. And, history kind of tends to rhyme and repeat in a lot of respects. And I sort of feel like we might be something similar now, that if they're not careful, a lot of this momentum that we are seeing this year and really last couple of years since the pitch clock came in, a lot of that could be sacrificed here.
No question. And as a baseball guy, as a business guy, that's why I love reading Front Office Sports, by the way. It always seems as though baseball shoots itself in the foot. I hope that's not the case here. I think they have a great opportunity. And listen, I know they're complex issues. I also know we can follow Eric and make sure we watch what he's reporting on up on Front Office Sports. Do that. Eric, thank you for taking time out of what is a busy week down at the All-Star Game to talk with us about the game.
My pleasure.
All right. Again, thank you to Eric Fisher from Front Office Sports. We're talking about, again, I always feel like baseball just shoots itself in the foot. So much wind, as Eric said, at the back of baseball right now. Increased attendance. You have Ohtani. You have Cal Raleigh. You have, of course, Aaron Judge. You have all these guys, Ellie De La Cruz down in Cincinnati, the Padres, the Dodgers, all this stuff going on. And the last thing you want to see them do is to ruin it by not coming to a good labor agreement. There's a lot of water to go over the dam before a conclusion is reached on this, but we appreciate Eric breaking down the complexities of it. Just a great guest as well here on this edition of Big League Buzz from SportsBot. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for tuning in to Uncapping the Future, MLB Salary Cap Showdown. We'll be back next time here with more Big League Buzz. Remember, if you subscribe on audio side, thank you. If you don't, guess what? You can get it wherever you get your audio. Do us a favor, rate and review wherever you listen to us. Also, if you're watching us on YouTube, do us a favor, subscribe to the channel, give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to hit that notifications bell so we can get back to you next time. For everybody here at Sports Not and Big League Buzz, I'm Scott Branson, and don't forget, keep swinging for the fences.